All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I'm going to do part 2 of a Mindgasms vlog today on the book The History of Sexuality, part 1 by Michel Foucault. He did what is called historiography in many of his books that are often put into the category of philosophy, but they're really more like history. Historiography is basically the history of ideas, concepts, and perspectives. In Discipline and Punish, which I made a video about a while ago, I'll add the link for that somewhere in the video and the description for this. Foucault wrote about the history of cultural attitudes and behavior toward criminals. In Madness and Civilization, which I will make a video or write a blog about later, Foucault talks about the history of cultural attitudes and behavior toward people with mental disorders. In all of the handful or so of his books that I've read, Foucault seems to analyze how these cultural attitudes have changed from approximately the 1600s to the 1800s and through to today. He also uses a multifactoral analysis. He explains the contributing causes that led to behaviors and attitudes changing from many different angles. There are many reasons that attitudes towards certain groups of people and behaviors change throughout history. So Foucault writes about how for the last 200 years, talk about sex has been multiplied rather than rarefied. This came along with taboos, prohibitions, and the creation of a fundamental and solidified sexual mosaic. The way that it was discussed was meant to conceal it. Until Freud, scholars always hid the thing they were speaking about. These detailed analyses were meant to evade the hazardous truth about sex. Here's a quote from Foucault about how science pathologized sex by focusing on abnormalities and condemning them, and moralized about it by scientifically classifying certain behaviors into higher moral categories than others. Quote, "It concerned itself primarily with aberrations, perversions, exceptional oddities, pathological abatements, and moral aggravations. It was by the same token a science subordinated in the main to the imperative of morality, whose divisions it reiterated under the guise of the medical norm." In the second part of that quote, Foucault is talking about the fact that scientists divided different sets of sexual behaviors into distinct moral categories. It's the idea that one sexual label is morally better than another, because scientists said that one is more medically beneficial than another. One type of sexual behavior is apparently more moral because it's better from a medical perspective, because science says so, bro. For example, after the categories of heterosexual and homosexual were created, it was seen as morally reprehensible to be gay and morally righteous to be straight. We all know about this, right? Until very recently in history, it was illegal to be homosexual almost everywhere in the world. Science provoked fear about sex by claiming to speak the truth. This included the supposed fact that if you are in a certain unusual category like homosexual, as Foucault puts it, quote, "it ascribed an imaginary dynasty of evils destined to be passed on for future generations," unquote. So not only are you morally corrupt if you are not heterosexual and you don't have standard, boring, non-experimental sex, you are evil, and your evil will be passed on to many of your future descendants. Sexual behavior that was seen as unusual or abnormal was also classified as a mania or disorder that is bad for all of society. Not only that, but according to these morally righteous scientists who spoke the truth, this sexual behavior would literally kill you. If you think that's bad, it gets even worse. Being a sexual deviant meant that you would eradicate the entire fucking human species. This is how Foucault puts it. Quote, "Strange pleasures," it warned, "would eventually result in nothing short of death, that of individuals, generations, the species itself," unquote. Foucault writes about how Western civilization has no ars erotica, or seeing sex as an art form. It is also the only civilization that created a scientia sexualis, or the scientific classification of sex. This is a way to tell the apparent truth about sex that is designed to form a quote-unquote knowledge power, as Foucault calls it. Scientists categorize and pathologize sex and give themselves power over others by having the ultimate knowledge and truth about it. These scientific explanations have more merit because they are the true knowledge, and the truth has the most power. This reminds Foucault of the Confession. Here's a quote. Quote, "Since the Middle Ages at least, Western societies have established the confession as one of the main rituals we rely on for the production of truth." Unquote. So confess your sins, you your dirty, morally corrupt sexual sins, you evil deviant who will die and pass on your evil to future generations, eventually eradicating the entire human race. Kneel at the altar of righteous science and religious moral values and accept the truth that your sexual identity is a fiery demon spawn from hell. Foucault talks about the fact that confession became ubiquitous in Western society. We voluntarily confess to everyone about everything, and were threatened or even tortured if we didn't do so. Foucault calls confession and torture, quote unquote, the dark twins, which I fucking love. That's such a great description. Here's the way that Foucault describes the intertwining of confession and torture. Quote, "The confession has spread its effects far and wide. It plays a part in justice, medicine, education, family relationships, and love relations. In the most ordinary affairs of everyday life, and in the most solemn rites, one confesses one's crimes, one's sins, one's thoughts and desires, one's illnesses and troubles. One goes about telling, with the greatest precision, whatever is most difficult to tell. One confesses in public and in private, to one's parents, one's educators, one's doctor, to those one loves. When it is not spontaneous or dictated by some internal imperative, the confession is wrung from a person by violence or threat. It is driven from its hiding place in the soul, or extracted from the body. Since the Middle Ages, torture has accompanied it like a shadow, and supported it when it could go no further, the dark twins. The most defenseless tenderness and bloodiest of powers have a similar need of confession. Western man has become a confessing animal." Unquote. Foucault elaborates on how sex was a main theme of Christian confession. It was supposedly hidden, but it actually was talked and thought about a lot by most people because it was seen as an impure and immoral sin that should be confessed. This sort of cultural norm enforces people to feel guilty about our completely natural sexual desires and behavior. Here's a quote of the way Foucault describes it. Quote, "A thing that was hidden, we are told. But what if, on the contrary, it was what, in a quite particular way, one confessed? Suppose the obligation to conceal it was but another aspect of the duty to admit to it, concealing it all the more with greater care, as the confession of it was more important, requiring a stricter ritual and promising more decisive effects. What if sex in our society, on a scale of several centuries, was something that was placed within an unrelenting system of confession? The transformation of sex into discourse, which I spoke of earlier, the dissemination and reinforcement of heterogeneous sexualities are perhaps two elements of the same deployment. They are linked together with the help of the central element of a confession that compels individuals to articulate their sexual peculiarity, no matter how extreme." Unquote. In the last part of that quote, Foucault is writing about the fact that sex was transformed into discourse. Remember from earlier that he was talking about how sex was reshaped from more of an art and just behavior with no particular label that you cannot escape, to a science in which everything was categorized and pathologized into different labels. Talking and thinking about sex from the perspective of it being a psychological and or biological flaw that we should feel guilty about enforced the idea of confessing about it. That's the first element that Foucault mentioned in that quote. The other one is this: sexuality was discussed often in public so it could be demonized, and people were put into categories based on specific sets of behavior, whereas they never had been before. The normal and morally righteous category was heterosexuality. So if you happened to be attracted to the opposite sex, you were a good person. But if you were attracted to someone with the same genitals as you, this was the wrong category. It meant that you were evil, scientifically flawed, would be killed by these desires, and would destroy our entire civilization if you weren't stopped. Foucault goes on to explain that since this cultural mindset was essentially ubiquitous, people were anxious to confess their sexual sins, since fetishes became anything that was not considered normal, boring sex. You have to confess your dirty and immoral desires, because otherwise God will condemn you to hell and you'll never go to heaven. Foucault compares the cultural mindset towards sex in ancient Greece to the puritanical Christian view that existed for hundreds of years in very recent history. This is what he says, quote, "In Greece, truth and sex were linked in the form of pedagogy by the transmission of precious knowledge from one body to another. Sex served as a medium for initiations into learning. For us, it is the confession that truth and sex are joined through the obligatory and exhaustive expression of an individual secret. But this time it is truth that serves as a medium for sex and its manifestations," unquote. In that quote, Foucault talks about the fact that in ancient Greece, truth and sex were linked because when you had sex with someone, you transmitted knowledge from your body to another, and you gained knowledge from them transmitting it to your body. Sex was a form of learning. Now, truth and sex are combined by confession. You incessantly share your immoral and disgusting sexual secrets. Sex is seen through the lens of truth, scientific categories, and pathologies, rather than from the perspective of sharing knowledge. All right, so this is where I'm going to stop for now. I'm probably going to do at least a few more videos about this book, I think, because I marked so many pages when I was reading it. I hope you all find Foucault's analysis on how cultural attitudes towards sex have changed throughout history to be as fascinating as I think it is. Thanks so much to everyone for watching this Mindgasms vlog, and thanks so much to everyone who likes, shares, comments on this video, and subscribes to my channel. Also, thanks so fucking much to anyone who subscribes to me on Patreon, and those of you who already have done so. That all really helps me out a lot, and you have no idea how much I appreciate it. So, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right, everyone. So keep having mindgasms and spreading your mindgasms all over the place. Adios until next time.